Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I'm Kent Shesky, and I serve as the Executive Vice President of the Council for Agriculture, Science, and Technology, or CAST. We're pleased to share with you our most recent CAST commentary, the role of agricultural science and technology on the Climate 21 project implementation. As noted on the agenda, we will have a question and answer session with a panel of our authors from today's commentary after our main presentation. And we'll open up the chat box in just a few minutes related to this topic. Please share any questions you may have. This webinar is part of a series on climate change co-hosted by the National Coalition for Food and Agriculture Research, or NCFAR. NCFAR is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, consensus-based coalition that seeks to sustain and enhance federal funding for food and agricultural research, extension, and education to bring about research outcomes that provide a range of major public benefits. The Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST, is a nonprofit 501c3 membership-supported organization comprised of scientific societies, companies, nonprofits, universities, libraries, and individual members. CAST was established in 1972 at the recommendation of the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council. CAST board is comprised of representatives of scientific societies, agribusiness, and nonprofits. It is through our network of volunteers and supporters that we select our topics for CAST papers and access volunteer scientists, economists, legal scholars, and other subject matter experts who help us produce the papers. Over the last 13 years, over 1,500 professionals have graciously volunteered their time, energy, and expertise to serve as authors of our papers or reviewers who help ensure each is unbiased and based upon sound science. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available later on our website. Toward the end of our main presentation, we'll post a message that the chat box is open for you to submit questions to our panelists. The task force for this paper was chaired by Dr. David Baltensperger, professor and department chair of the Soil and Crop Science Department at Texas A&M University and the current president of CAST. Dr. Baltensperger provides leadership and administration for a large comprehensive program of research, teaching, and extension in his department at Texas A&M. He has been an individual member of CAST for more than 20 years, and before being elected president, served as a board representative for the Crop Science Society of America and was also the society liaison to the board of directors. I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Baltensperger to share the highlights of this paper.
So let's go to the next slide. The role agriculture is central to climate mitigation and adaptation. Agriculture in the broad sense, including forestry, is a net sequestration sink for carbon dioxide. It can provide 10 to 20% of sequestration and emissions required to achieve net zero emissions. The USDA has not historically been at the center of public conversation on federal climate policy. USDA has resources that can be leveraged to achieve these goals, and the USDA agencies, including NEPA and the land grant system, has expertise to provide leadership in this arena, to partner with agriculture producers to reduce greenhouse gases through carbon sequestration and emission reductions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from rural energy, bolster resilience of private lands, and promote sustainable bioenergy and bio-based materials and bioenergy, to contribute to scientific understanding of climate change, and to invest in climate-smart economic development in rural communities. The Climate 21 project, as unveiled by the Biden transition team, serves as a blueprint for how the USDA can help advance the role of agriculture to mitigate and adapt to climate change pressures. It recommends the USDA help advance the role of agriculture and forestry by directing the department to invest in natural climate solutions, to decarbonize rural energy, and to promote green energy and smart grids, to prioritize investment to address wildfire, and Senate action this week moves this forward even further. This paper explores the potential for the USDA to emphasize collaboration, incentives, the historic resiliency, and innovation of agriculture and forestry and the critical role that rural America can play in addressing climate change while creating jobs and economic opportunity. CAST and CAST members can be a critical resource to the USDA to meet these goals. We can help indicate to the USDA and Congress where funding is needed to meet these goals, and to accomplish our objectives, CAST sought authors who are recognized for their research and leadership in managed plant landscapes, animal systems, agricultural technology, food systems, and carbon markets based on alterations in managed agricultural systems. These authors reflect a breadth of scientific expertise across CAST membership areas, including individual members, corporate partners, scientific society members. The target audience is the USDA and staff appointed or signed to work on Climate 21 initiative, federal legislative staff who will be involved in funding new Climate 21 initiatives, and scientists, stakeholder, non-government organizations in industry that can use the report as a guide to where they can provide support and engage in Climate 21 initiatives. Just a brief overview of the task force members that participated in writing the report, the reviewers, and the leadership that was engaged. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Marty Matlock, who is the Executive Director of the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center and professor in the Biological Agricultural Engineering Department at the University of Arkansas, and was the 2018 recipient of the Borlaug CAST Communication Award. Marty, take it away.
Thank you, David. All right, so the first thing to recognize is that when we have a problem, we need to understand the metrics in order to solve the problem. If we look at total US greenhouse gas emissions, go ahead and click forward once, you can see that only 10% of our greenhouse gas from the United States, according to EPA, of the 6.6 billion metric tons emitted from all US sectors, only 10% of that roughly was from agriculture. Now, US EPA's boundaries on the agricultural system are a little different than most life cycle assessment boundaries. So transportation is its own sector. And so to be clear, there's a little bit of fuzziness in these lines, but you see that we're talking about 10% of the 6.6 billion metric tons. And actually it's less than 6.6 when you consider the sequestration amount that goes into that. So 5.8 billion metric tons after land sequestration. So ag contributes about 580 teragrams or 0.58 billion metric tons. Total greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors in 2019 around the world were about 37 billion metric tons. So we're about a sixth of total. Next slide. If we look at where that comes from in agriculture, most of that is coming from the activities of crop cultivation, and then livestock, predominantly from methanogenesis, and then fuel combustion in those orders. We've actually, with the dramatic increases over the last 30 years of yield, relatively stable land occupation, but dramatic increases of yield, we have only increased greenhouse gas emissions by about 8.4%. So on a yield basis, we've actually become more efficient. Livestock production has also increased. And so that's pretty much while we've increased feed efficiency conversion, we pretty much have a head-to-head tracking of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not exactly that because we're producing more livestock than 30 years ago, and we're producing it more efficiently with higher feed conversion rate efficiencies and reduced impacts from methanogenesis, from manure management, and with better controls over their living conditions. Fuel combustion has decreased almost 9% over the last 30 years. So we understand where we're making progress and where we have challenges. Methane is one of our big challenges in agriculture. Next slide, please. Writ large, about 8.9 of the 37 gigatons of carbon emitted by humans every year comes from directly from fossil fuels. Now, we can sequester 2,400 gigatons of organic carbon in the soil annually, potentially. It's already there up to 2 meters deep. So if you look at the little tan colored dot with the red dot in the middle. The tan colored dot is how much carbon is being could be sequestered in the organic soils, versus the red dot, it's how much direct fossil fuel emissions occur. So that's about 4/1000ths of the relationship. So just keep that 4/1000ths or in mind. Next slide, please. So for soils that have less than typically carbon stocks of less than 80 kilograms per cubic meter of, 80 grams per cubic meter of organic carbon, and then that's the sweet spot for sequestering. Anything more than that, we start to approach an asymptote to reduce rates of sequestration. But we can sequester a lot of carbon in soil that's below that 80 threshold. And you can see that represents much of our ERS heartland region. Basically, many of the soils outside of the South and the Eastern Seaboard and the far northwestern part of the US. So much of our primary ag lands, we still have room to increase the rate of sequestration of soil. So this is one of our positive opportunities for agriculture to become the solution to climate change and not part of the problem. Next slide, please. And we already know that we have a number of tools in our toolbox to achieve these goals. Cropping systems, BMPs, for example, we have a number from Postian and Chambers. We have high residue crops, cover crops, a whole suite, and animal BMPs, same thing. We have a number of opportunities for improvement. So these opportunities are available to farmers now. They've been adopted across most of the production landscape at various levels. What we have to do now is start focusing on where our next tier of innovations are going to be, where our gaps in adoption are, what the barriers to adoption are, and start moving to adoption. So now I'd like to pass the microphone over to Dr. Tricarico. Juan, take it away.
Let me introduce Juan. Juan is the Vice President of Sustainable Research at Dairy Management Incorporated and the past president of CAST. So Juan.
Thank you very much, Dave, for the introduction. So I am going to speak about the animal systems, and this part of the presentation looks at it from three different elements. First of all, recognition that animal agriculture can in fact contribute to reversing climate change. The focus on emissions that we are seeing associated with consumption of animal source foods is understates basically a variety of broad societal contributions. For example, we know that animal sourced foods supply important nutrients to vulnerable populations, and that those include children. They also include the elderly, but also other types of individuals like pregnant women and adolescent females. And this becomes even more important in low-income countries where the consumption of animal source foods is low to begin with. We also understand that sustainable intensification is important to meet these growing nutritional demands that come along with growing population, with the use of less resources, and also with the emissions of less greenhouse gases that affect climate change. Once again, this also becomes important in some of the countries globally where low productivity is the norm, because there's a better opportunity in those types of situations to use resources more effectively and also produce less emissions per unit of food produced. We also understand that climate change affects animal ag itself, and that it can actually affect negatively animal productivity. So this goes back all the way to cropping for feed products, to aspects like heat stress for the animals themselves, and also disease pressure, etc. And then finally, I want to make sure that everybody understands that this opportunity to contribute to reverting climate change by focusing on both soil carbon sequestration from the growth of feed animal crops and also methane mitigation places animal agriculture in a unique position to convert climate change impact into a societal benefit. So let's go to the next slide, please. And here what we see, first of all, I'm going to talk about focus, where focus is needed for animal agriculture to contribute to reverting, the climate crisis. So first of all, the use of positive climate actions by many agricultural operators are actually needed to reverse the climate trajectory. So it's not about just a handful of operators implementing some of these practices or climate actions, but actually these climate actions being pervasive and being implemented by a significant amount of operators so that change can actually occur. Now, ideally, farmers and ranchers will mitigate because of the three elements that are highlighted in this slide. First of all, because it's both environmentally and productively advantageous, because it is recognized through measurement and recording. And finally, because it is rewarded both financially and reputationally. This is very important. Not only should that recognition be financial, but also reputational. It means that it's important for that narrative to be complete and for everyone to understand the benefits that are associated to animal systems in agriculture, as opposed to only having a discussion of detriments. In order for this to occur, not only do biophysical innovation need to happen with development of technologies and practices, but also socioeconomic innovation. And these socioeconomic innovation are critical because they're needed to incentivize a positive environment where climate action by animal agriculture operators is, in fact, like I said, incentivized. Of course, transparency about mitigation is indispensable because it's critical to understand that, or to ensure, I should say, that consumers trust the agricultural system that, in fact, nourishes them. Next slide, please. So this is where investment needs to go for animal agriculture to contribute to reverting the climate crisis. And so I had mentioned in the previous slide, biophysical, so biological and physical innovation on the one hand side, to solve for those issues that relate to the biological limits and some of the physical environmental limits, but also there's socioeconomic innovation on the right-hand side of this slide, once again, to incentivize, to make sure that what's available gets in fact implemented. I am not going to read these two lists because you can actually read a lot quicker than I can speak. However, I do want to point out that, on the biological physical innovation side, we're talking about things such as, for example, improving digestibility of feeds or understanding the effects of the microbiome on methane production so that, efficient use of feed can be achieved, and also lower methane emissions per unit of feed digested can also be achieved. And then on the socioeconomic side, examples are things like, for example, developing robust and verifiable mitigation protocols so that transactions can actually occur, so that different actors within the value chain can actually transact carbon credits and in a trusted fashion. Also, for another example that I'd like to talk about here is developing regulatory pathways that are specific for climate change claims. So the companies that develop this type of solutions don't have to go down a new drug application, for example, in the case of animal feeds, to be able to market it when what they really want to do is claim an environmental benefit. The final point I want to make on this particular slide is that we want to increase and reorganize the public funding for the purpose that public funding is the basis in terms of biological, physical, and socioeconomic innovation that then allows private operators to capitalize on market opportunities. Okay, so that's the importance of public funding, to bringing that basis so that then the private enterprise can actually deliver solutions off of a solid basis. Next slide, and final slide, please, is the fact that public-private partnering and market focus are essential for climate action to occur. So from identification to delivery to eventually adoption, you need public-private partnership to take everything across the the pipeline. The largest opportunities to revert climate change are in fact in these public-private partnerships. And like I said before, it is critical. The focus should be placed in creating environments that identify, that quantify, and that reward positive climate action by these economic actors. Finally, I just want to highlight that this slide also includes a few bullet points here in terms of the potential objectives for the type of collaboration. I am not going to read them. You've obviously read them already. And with that, I'm going to pass it on back to Dave. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Alex Thomasson, professor, department head, and the very endowed chair in agriculture and biological engineering at Mississippi State University, and serves on the CAST Board of Representatives on behalf of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. Take it away, Alex.
Thank you, David. And let me just thank my co-authors, Addie Thompson and Jianming Yu, for their efforts in writing our section on agricultural technologies. Many such technologies exist, but this section is limited to two principal areas that have received tremendous interest and R&D investment recently. Those are precision agriculture and advanced breeding technologies. So I'll start here by giving a rough definition of precision agriculture. It involves the employment of advanced technologies like GPS, sensors, computing systems, analytical tools, including artificial intelligence, geographic information systems, communications, and robotics. And the purpose is to apply farm inputs such as fertilizer and water at the optimal location, in the optimal amount, and at the optimal time. The goal of precision agriculture is to maximize economic productivity while minimizing environmental risk at as fine a level of detail as possible, for example, by the square meter. Next slide, please. Precision agriculture has been developing for over 25 years, and so some conclusions can be drawn about how various applications relate to the climate. We can divide these well-studied applications into two groups. One is those that have significant effects on greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is those that have minimal effects or are expected to have minimal effects. In the first category, significant effects, GPS-based automatic guidance, common on new larger tractors and harvesters, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions mainly by driving precisely straight lines and minimizing overlaps in field operations, thus reducing wastage of fossil fuel and over-application of inputs. Furthermore, variable rate fertilizer application can have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions in a direct sense by typically reducing the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that is distributed on the field and thus reducing nitrogen-related emissions from the soil. And in an indirect sense by reducing the amount of CO2 released to the atmosphere as part of the fertilizer manufacturing process. Also, variable rate irrigation can have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions. First, in a direct sense, by reducing the amount of water pumped and distributed on the field, and thus reducing the amount of fossil fuel used to power irrigation pumps. And in an indirect sense, by reducing the amount of denitrification that occurs in soils when they are overwatered. In the second category of precision agriculture applications, those with minimal effects, variable rate pesticide application typically reduces the overall amount of pesticide applied, but is not considered to have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions because of the low overall application rates. Also, variable rate weeding done through various means typically reduces the amount of energy or material applied, but is not considered to have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions, again, because of the low overall application rates. Furthermore, the increasingly widespread practice of variable rate planting or seeding is not considered to have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. I'll provide here an idea of what we mean by advanced breeding technologies. They include the concepts of phenomics, which involves efficient methods for measuring plant or animal phenotypes, like height, yield, growth rate, etc. Autonomous platforms like drones or ground-based robots, and sensors like multispectral and thermal infrared cameras. The purpose is to collect data on large numbers of plots or individual plants. And also genomics, which involves measurement and analysis of plant or animal genes, genome-wide association studies in which genes across the genome are considered relative to specific phenotypes, and identification of specific quantitative trait loci in which individual genes are identified relative to specific phenotypes. Next slide, please. The integration of phenomics and genomics in breeding is rather new, so little has been confirmed about this technology in terms of its relation to the climate. However, in plants, the main traits we can seek to improve relate to carbon sequestration. Plants extract CO2 from the air to produce biomass both above ground and below ground. While above ground biomass temporarily sequesters carbon, deeper and bushier root systems in plants can sequester carbon in the soil for longer periods of time and thus have a greater effect on atmospheric CO2. Integrating phenomics and genomics enables more rapid improvement in plants than traditional breeding techniques. The greatest difficulty is in phenotypic measurement of plant roots, which are extremely difficult to perform rapidly and non-destructively. Another issue requiring research is the length of time that carbon can be sequestered in plants, particularly in the roots, which depend on multiple factors, including temperature and soil moisture. In summary, let me just say that precision agriculture can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, mainly through efficiencies gained by automatic guidance and direct and indirect emissions reductions through variable rate fertilizer application and variable rate irrigation. A review of the science related to advanced crop breeding suggests that it can have a major positive impact in terms of the carbon sequestration capabilities of plants. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, David.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Dr. Zhengxia, Professor of Agriculture Systems at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, and was the task force chair of the 2018 CAST issue paper, Food, Loss, and Waste. Take it away, Dr. Dow.
Thank you, David. The co-authors for this essay are Dr. Dave Galligan of PenVet and Dr. Jerry Sherson at University of Minnesota. So let's start with the best kept secret. That is 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption is never eaten, but lost or wasted along the food supply chain. And of course, this has huge climate footprints. And globally, 8 to 10% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are can be attributed to food loss and waste. This includes direct emissions from the wasted food materials, as well as indirect emissions through the life cycle effect. And if you consider food waste as a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter, just behind China and the US. Next, please. So where does the huge amount of food waste we produce goes? It goes to landfill in the most cases, and where in the landfill it's converted to methane, along with some other pollution problems. So our challenge and our opportunity is to treat the food waste instead of waste, sending it to landfill. Instead of that, but convert it as resources and convert it for beneficial use. And composting is, I'm sure most people are familiar with. It uses bacteria to convert the materials into compost. So your product, compost, can be applied to the soil and soil amendment, and it would offset fertilizer. So that offset would have a life cycle carbon reduction benefit. Okay, and then the next one, also a lot of people are familiar with, and it's this is increasing in popularity, is anaerobic digestion. What it does through the anaerobic digester is that food waste is degraded by microbes, and biogas is generated, with biogas, that's a form of bioenergy you could use for heating or convert it into electricity. So that itself has the life cycle carbon reduction effect. And also the digester, that is what's left in the digester, could also be applied to the soil, replacing with the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, replacing some of the fertilizer needed for growing crops. Again, there will be life cycle carbon reduction effects. And the third option I'm going to bring your attention to is a refeed, standing for repurposing food waste for animal feeding. And this option offers a great deal of potential. So what you do is collected food waste and treat it through technologies and convert it into animal feeds. And these feeds could be utilized to offset the feed grains like corn, soybeans, or grasses like alfalfa hay and grass hay. And this offset of conventional feed ingredients would allow us to spare the resources that would be otherwise needed to produce the conventional feeds. So this includes land, water, and energy, and fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, etc. This will be spared. And also nitrogen and phosphorus losses associated with the production of the conventional feeds will be avoided. So would the greenhouse gas emissions during the field operations, such as nitrous oxide. Of course, the spared resources have associated indirect life cycle carbon reduction benefit. And this refeed is a very important, critical option here, because you through livestock, that's the best recycler in the food system. And through the animals, we upcycle the nutrients like proteins and carbohydrates and minerals still contained in the food waste. And we upcycle the nutrients in production for meats and milk and eggs. Next, please. So what are the things we needed as urgent actions? First of all, we need a national framework and to focus on expanding the commercialization of food waste recycling options and its implementation. And we also need policies and incentives at the local, regional, and national level that would encourage the investment and commercialization implementation of these higher value food waste reuse practices. Next, please. And additionally, we need to address the biosafety concerns of feeds to be produced from food waste. There are a number of items under that category, including applying the Food Safety Modernization Act regulations, including re-evaluating the applicability of the Swan Health Protection Act, and re-evaluating the current thermal processing, that's the conditions to ensure the biosafety of the feeds produced, etc. And we also need to establish the life cycle carbon reduction credits for the different food waste recycling options, such as composting, anaerobic digestion, and refeed, and to promote the adoption and implementation across the country. And lastly, we need the society's perceptions and consumer acceptance, and we need to shift these perceptions and promote consumer acceptance. And instead of thinking food waste as garbage, we ought to consider it and treat it as a resource for beneficial reuse. Back to you, David.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to wrap it up for us today with how do we make carbon markets work for agriculture. Ms. Debbie Reed is the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium and the Ecosystem Services Market Research Consortium, utilizing decades of experience in agriculture climate change mitigation and sustainability efforts nationally and internationally. Take it away, Debbie.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all the previous speakers. And I'd also like to thank Christine Morgan, who was my co-author on this chapter. We focused on making carbon markets work to mitigate greenhouse gases from agriculture. I would like to note carbon markets are really just one tool of many that can be utilized to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and also increase soil carbon sequestration. They are, however, a particularly attractive tool since they do offer to help to pay farmers for their services, many of which are in high demand by society right now. You alluded to the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. We're a public-private partnership working on a national scale ecosystem service market dedicated exclusively to agriculture. While we focus, and I think while carbon markets focus on all greenhouse gases from agriculture, including soil carbon, reduced methane, nitrous oxide, reducing carbon dioxide, for the purposes of this essay, we focused exclusively on monitoring, quantifying soil carbon sequestration. I will say that there are similar, though different, challenges associated with quantifying and monitoring nitrous oxide and methane. Some of the other chapters actually got into that, particularly related to livestock agriculture. The main difference, of course, for agriculture is, or for soil carbon, is one of duration or permanence, at least when we're talking about a carbon markets perspective. The last thing I'll note is that quantifying carbon and greenhouse gases in ecosystem service markets and carbon markets requires more granularity and precision than for other monitoring and conservation purposes. So for instance, quantifying the outcomes of USDA conservation programs or quantifying the US greenhouse gas inventory happens at a very different level of granularity and allows for much greater uncertainty because you're not selling something, you're not transacting something. That is why we have a lot of the challenges that we have when it comes to quantifying changes in greenhouse gas emissions for agriculture. On this slide here, I will also note that, you know, one of the focus or one of the questions you might be asking is why ag? Why ag as a focus in carbon markets? There's significant demand right now from multiple demand side players, investors, et cetera, for ag solutions in carbon markets and in soil carbon sequestration in particular. There's also skepticism from some quarters that also speaks to the need for credibility and integrity in quantifying and verifying changes in greenhouse gases, particularly when we're selling them. You know, the point here is that there is huge potential solutions coming from agriculture, not just in the United States, but globally when we're talking about mitigating climate change. There are also low relative opportunity costs when you compare it to other investments across different sectors, and high impacts and high benefits that go above and beyond greenhouse gases and that go above and beyond the farm gate, if you will. Also, agriculture is a business done outdoors, and there's a need to increase the resilience of the agricultural sector to climate change impacts. And most of the technologies or practices that improve soil carbon sequestration that reduce greenhouse gases also impart increased resilience to agriculture. So the summary here is that there's significant potential benefits. And right now, there are estimates of up to $100 billion in demand from carbon offsets in carbon markets globally. So again, a potential great mitigation opportunity. If you go to the next slide, some of the challenges with quantifying and tracking changes in soil organic carbon include, you know, there's high geospatial variability of soil carbon, not just at field or regional scales, but also across different depths in the soil profile. So we're talking about 3D geospatial variability. So that makes quantification with certainty difficult, but perhaps more importantly, difficult at a cost-effective means. Also, there is no global or US agreement on one approach to quantify soil carbon or changes in soil carbon, either at a project or greater scales. That is something that I think is just hampering progress on our ability to report this, not just in markets, but elsewhere as well. It's also led to a proliferation of proposed approaches, not all of which have been ground truthed or have credibility. I know USDA is launching an effort to focus on quantifying soil carbon, and we really look forward to that. Our paper, again, focused on changes in soil carbon, and we looked at significant investments that are being made in cost-effective yet accurate integrated approaches for quantifying soil carbon and changes in soil carbon. And if you go to the next slide, what this slide really shows across the board is that there's lots of new tools and technologies being utilized in this space. The cost and the commercial viability of most is still really inconsistent with what we need for accuracy and cost, if you will, in market applications. We do anticipate that increased and continued investments in these tools and technologies will change over time. But as this slide shows, the cost and the accuracy of tools and technologies are generally inversely related. So what we are advocating and what we are utilizing currently is integrated quantification approaches that utilize soil carbon's core sampling with technologies such as proximal and remote sensing, whether that's satellite imagery or tools that are embedded in the soils to quantify what's happening, as well as the use of biogeochemical process models. Those integrated approaches really right now are offering the greatest quantification rigor to meet market standards and also to start to provide less costly verification as well as quantification approaches. Thanks so much.
And now, thanks to all of our speakers today, and thanks to all the participants who've joined us online. At this stage, we wanted to open it up for questions from the participants. And Melissa, maybe you can share with them some of the many ways they can ask those questions.
We have the chat box is open for people to submit their questions in chat.
Okay. We started off with a question early on. Should the goal be to decarbonize agriculture or make agriculture a human activity that fixes carbon emitted to any sector in which it is impossible to sequester carbon? And perhaps we could get a comment from Marty Matlock on that.
Certainly, it's a good question, and Debbie and I have had many discussions about this over the years, and I agree with our general assessment that that benchmarking and measuring success against your own sector is an incredibly motivating way to move things. And I yield to her expertise in how markets work and how to drive markets. But I can tell you the atmosphere doesn't care which sector the greenhouse gases come from. The atmosphere just reacts to the mass of greenhouse gases being emitted. And so all the reduction we can achieve with all practical mechanisms are desirable. And if we can achieve significantly higher reductions than each sector emits, that's even better. And we also have to understand that animal agriculture is not going to be on the same footing as crop agriculture in terms of potential for sequestering, because animals stand on the soil, but they do not sequester the carbon into the soil like plants do. And so we have to recognize that agriculture writ large is a huge human endeavor. The total system delivers over 15 trillion kilocalories a day all around the world to 7.5 billion brothers and sisters. And so we have to find a way to actually motivate all sectors of agriculture to reduce emissions and to increase sequestration.
Debbie, any comments on that?
No, I think Marty is dead on. The only thing I would add is that the way countries and companies report greenhouse gas emissions is by sector, and agriculture will always be compared by its footprint. So I would advocate that to drop that, right, for optical as well as other purposes, is that we focus first and foremost on neutralizing agriculture's greenhouse gas footprint, and then talking about how ag can also neutralize and reduce other sectors' footprints.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. How do authors propose to address the complexity of competing goals in resistance management versus carbon sequestration? And the report seems to imply that pesticides will be the primary tool enabling conservation tillage. Given the explosion in resistance, how can the agriculture community work together to address challenges holistically? And Marty, we'll turn it to you again for an initial answer, but maybe Alex can weigh in with some of his technology.
Certainly. First and foremost, we have been fighting pests in what we grow since we planted our first seed, and we will continue to do so. And so I just want to make it clear that pesticides are one of our tools in our toolbox. We need every tool, and we need new tools. And that's where Alex's work is so critical. The opportunity for new tools are on the horizon, more than on the horizon, within reach. They're already been piloted. So I think we're going to see production systems. We're going to see systems for pest management that are going to be transformational within the next 5 years. That are, some will be chemical based, some will be genetic based, and some will be mechanical automation based.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Just a quick comment, and that is that, you know, the purpose of precision agriculture is to apply whatever mechanism that you intend to apply, for example, for weeds or insects, at the finest level possible, potentially even down to the individual plant. We're getting to the point now where we've got sensing technologies that can enable that kind of application, and that greatly, regardless of the means of destruction, that greatly reduces the opportunity for the building up of resistance.
Okay, thank you. The next question I see was, you talk about new practice adoption. Does that mean the progressive innovative growers who have already adopted the practices are not considered in these programs? This was aimed at Juan, but it impacts the plants as well.
And I just simply said that the general principle across all sustainable programs, we started talking about sustainable ag initiatives 20 years ago as a formal framework, was you don't penalize the early adopters ever. You celebrate and elevate the early adopters, the innovators. And so you don't want to create a system where people want to wait until the carbon premium reaches a threshold before they implement, and so they can get the maximum benefit. No, so we have to create systems. And Debbie has been really thinking a lot about this, because this is really in her bailiwick. So I'm going to bounce the ball to Debbie, if that's okay, David.
Okay.
Thanks, Marty. So I'll say this, in markets, right, we have to have buyers. Buyers are paying for new product and new outcomes. So we have to ensure that whatever we do meets the buyer needs, because we don't want to create assets that no one buys, right? So we're approaching it from that perspective. I think the other thing is that in current markets, what is viewed as additional or new is sometimes just not realistic, particularly when you get to ag. So for instance, in a lot of current markets, 5% penetration of any given practice in a given geography is viewed as a maximum rate beyond which there's no additionality. So if you have 5% penetration of practice, then it's no longer additional regardless of anybody who adopts it. We are using a 50% practice generation rate to try to change that. And I think we could even go higher, right? But it's about how you actually define new practice, new product, and additionality in these biological systems, which are really complicated.
Thank you. And let's move on to another question. Are there promising technologies such as new feed additives in the pipeline that could significantly lower methane emissions per head of ruminant livestock?
Yes, thank you. That one's for me. And a couple of years ago, I would have said no, but today there are more than one. So there's been quite a bit of investment, primarily by private companies, to develop additives that can actually address this issue. The challenge right now in adopting this type of feed additives is that reduction in methane emissions that they achieve don't pay back the cost of adoption. And so once again, the socioeconomic innovation elements that I was highlighting during my portion of the essay become important. Like Debbie said, markets are one way, but it's only one. You know, there are other elements, and there are, for example, value chains that are willing to cover the cost, to cost sharing type approaches, where the cost is actually shared amongst value chain members for the farmer to actually adopt or utilize a particular feed additive. It's too early to say where this is going to land, but I am very optimistic that we're going to see implementation of feed additives sooner rather than later.
Great. Another question. It is not likely that the market will wait for the measurement technology to catch up. If credits are traded now at a given dollar per unit, how do you envision this will be corrected later when better measurement tools are developed?
It's an excellent question. And the way the market addresses it is you get a discount for uncertainty. So you don't get paid for anything you can't prove with certainty. And that in that way, you're not overpaying for something that doesn't exist.
Thank you. What is the role and challenge of advancing carbon tech in agriculture? Alex, do you want to take a shot at that one?
Sorry, David, I didn't quite catch the question.
The question said, what is the role and challenge of advancing carbon technology in agriculture?
The role and challenge of advancing carbon technology. Are you clear on the meaning of carbon technology in that context?
That's the detail I have right now. I guess maybe I'd take a shot. You know, this whole paper has addressed, in my mind, that question. We have a large role. We have a difference to make. Ag can make a big difference, and I think that technology is what it's going to take to make that difference. So I think we as panelists are all excited about the opportunity. If I missed the question, you can enter it again further down.
I was thinking too specifically, but thanks for the help.
Do we know the estimate of carbon loss from U.S. cropland and how much can be sequestered back by using conservative practices? Cover crop, no-till, et cetera, realistically. Who wants to take a shot at that? Marty or Debbie?
Well, I mean, it depends. It's so variable. Debbie talked about that in her description of how measuring organic carbon is so hard. It's so variable that we generally have a sense of how much we've lost over the last 100 years, and over a decade, we can pretty much tell how much we lost. But trying to measure that year to year is like trying to weigh yourself every morning. It just goes up and down, and so it just doesn't really give you the sort of directional motivation that's valuable. Debbie?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, coupled with that variability, is the fact that we're losing so much agricultural farmland, rangeland, grassland every year, that our technical ability to mitigate and put that back goes down every year. And I will say that California figured this out 10 years after they launched their greenhouse gas program, that they weren't accounting for land use change, they weren't accounting for agriculture, and their baseline was going up, making it incredibly difficult to meet that. We're starting to hear nationally, internationally, governments, policymakers understanding that and starting to approach that. It's an incredibly important point. Protect existing soil carbon stocks first, and then work on putting back what we've lost.
And we have a question here on food waste. So Dr. Dow, what are the role of food waste, ag waste, and better ag practices related to renewable fuels such as biogas, RNG/crop-based biofuels, and policies such as LCFSFs on other RPS programs? And I hope you know those acronyms.
Not exactly, not all of them, some of them. And I wanted to say that food waste is not created equal. So different types of food, food waste, you have a priority uses. For example, the high quality food waste would be best suitable for animal feeding and conversion into animal feeds, right? And some low quality food waste, probably composting and anaerobic digestion would be the options to go. So I think given the complexity of food waste and what's in nature, I think a species-specific strategies would make sense. And this would consider, for example, post-consumer food waste might be best suited for composting and anaerobic digestion. And then anaerobic digestion, there you have the biogas and bioenergy, etc. While the pre-consumer food waste could be a higher quality, could be separated, the plant-based from animal source, animal-based, and then the plant-based items could be converted into feeds for ruminants. That's for their fiber and other energies best to use. So it really depends.
Thank you. And I think that we might have time for one or two more questions, but we need just a little wrap-up time. So let's try this question here. Recent research in Italy has shown biostimulants have the ability to reduce greenhouse gas by increasing fertilizer efficiency and increase overall soil carbon. Has the group examined the input pack of ag inputs as a means to abate emissions? And I'd just take a shot at this one. There's a lot of research on this area. Are there a lot of results that are clear and precise at this stage? No, but we know that our ag inputs are a contributor to the problem. And therefore, anything we can do to reduce the carbon in those inputs or the carbon required for those inputs will be helpful. And biostimulants are certainly an active area of investigation right now. So we're excited about that research, but the answers are less than clear on a massive scale. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Kent to wrap us up.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you to all the panelists. It's been a great presentation and great discussion in our Q&A. We have captured these questions and we will be sharing them with the panelists and getting answers, and look for in some of our casts coming Friday notes or other publications. We will get these out to you and make as many of the answers to your questions, even those that we didn't have time for today. But again, thank you for joining us. Here is some information about how to contact any of our speakers individually, as you like, emails, and also if you've not downloaded and looked at our CAST publication, here's the address to go find it as well. Next slide. We have some rollouts that we're working on finalizing some papers that we hope to be rolling out over the next months and into the fall. One is a paper on GMO-free, the impact on consumers, retailers, farmers, and the environment. Another paper on goals, strengths, and limitations of using for the use of life cycle assessments in food and agriculture. And Dr. Matlock has played a key role in that paper as well. And then if you notice in my comments, CAST is coming upon its 50th anniversary in 2022. So we're producing a publication that will look at kind of CAST past, present, and future, and kind of helps stage what we hope will be a year-long dialogue about what we should be doing to remain viable and relevant in a changing world of science communication. So we invite you to follow that one as discussion as well. I would also invite you to visit any of our websites and all social media platforms to stay abreast of activities and events and further releases that we'll be doing. All of these are accessible to you, and particularly our CAST website is listed there on the bottom of the page. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation and learned more about this important topic. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.